My parents introduced me as the maid, not their daughter, not as someone who had grown up in the same house, eaten at the same table, shared a bathroom with my sister for 14 years, the maid. And the man standing next to my sister, the man she had been dating for 8 months, the man who had flown in from Boston specifically to meet the family she had been describing to him for almost a year, heard every word. I want to tell you exactly what my mother said. We were in the foyer of my parents' house. My sister, Vivian, was standing beside this man, tall, well-dressed, the particular kind of quietly confident that comes from a certain kind of upbringing. And my mother was doing what she always does in important moments, which is perform a version of our family that she has been carefully constructing for years. And this is Elena, my mother said, gesturing toward me with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. She helps us with the house. She helps us with the house. I was holding a dish towel. I had been washing up after a meal I had cooked for 6 people because my mother had asked me to come over early and help prepare. I had flour on my apron. I looked exactly like what she said I was. The man, his name was James, looked at me. He smiled. He said, "Nice to meet you." And I said, "You too." And I went back into the kitchen and I stood at the sink and I turned on the tap and I washed the same pan 3 times because I needed something to do with my hands. I was 27 years old. I had a degree. I had a job. I had my own apartment 12 minutes from this house. I had a name on a lease, a name on a paycheck, a name on a utility bill. My parents had just handed it to a stranger as a job title. And what James did with what he had just seen, quietly over the following weeks without anyone knowing he was doing it, is the reason I am sitting here telling you this story. In about 70 minutes, you are going to understand everything. My name is Elena. I'm 29 years old. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona now, have for the past year and a half, though I grew up in Phoenix, in a house in a nice enough neighborhood that looked, from the outside, like exactly what it was. A family doing reasonably well. The operative word is looked. I work in project management for a mid-sized construction firm. I am organized, reliable, and good at keeping multiple, complicated things moving simultaneously without losing track of any of them. I have been told, more than once, that my ability to manage chaos without appearing to be managing it is my defining professional quality. I did not learn that skill at work. I learned it at home over the course of 27 years in a family where managing the presentation of things was the primary ongoing project. My sister's name is Vivian. She's 32, 3 years older than me. She is beautiful in the way that gets noticed immediately, and she has always known this, and she has always used it. And none of that is a criticism. It is just a fact about who she is and how she operates in the world. She has also, for most of her adult life, made choices that are either genuinely fortunate or strategically excellent, depending on how generously you read them. At 32, Vivian has never held a full-time job for more than 18 months. She has instead moved through a series of what she describes as opportunities, a boutique she co-owned briefly, a consulting arrangement that mostly involved attending events, a content creation venture that she funded partly through my parents and partly through a relationship she was in at the time. None of them lasted. All of them were funded. My parents funded them. I want to be precise about numbers because I am a project manager and numbers are how I understand the world. In the 5 years between Vivian's graduation and the day James arrived at my parents' house for the family dinner, my parents contributed the following to Vivian's life: $41,000 across 3 business ventures that did not survive, $14,000 for a car, a specific car, a leased vehicle she had wanted, paid in full by my father as a birthday gift when she turned 28. $8,000 described as living support during the 6 months after the boutique closed and before she found the next arrangement. A total of $63,000. I know this number because I am the person my parents called during every one of those funding moments. Not to ask me to contribute, to ask me to advise, to run the numbers, to review the business plan, to give my honest assessment of whether the venture was viable. They asked for my honest assessment. They then made the opposite decision. Every time. My parents never funded me. Not because I asked and was refused. I didn't ask because I had watched what happened to the money I helped them evaluate, and I had decided by my mid-20s that I was not going to put myself in the position of being a Vivian-adjacent venture. I paid for my own college. Not entirely. I had some scholarship help, but I covered the gap with work study, a part-time job, and a loan I finished paying off at 26. I furnished my own apartment. I bought my own car. I established my own credit, built my own savings, and paid my own bills without crisis calls to my parents at midnight. In my family, I was the daughter who handled things. In my family, Vivian was the daughter who was handled. The distinction sounds almost neutral when I describe it that way. It wasn't neutral. It was a consistent, decades-long message about whose potential mattered, whose choices deserved investment, whose existence was worth the family's resources. And when my mother introduced me as the maid, standing in the foyer with a dish towel and flour on my apron, while the man Vivian had been describing for 8 months smiled at me politely and said, "Nice to meet you," that message arrived with more precision than anything my parents had said out loud in 27 years. Let me take you back to how that evening started. Vivian had called me the week before. She'd been calling more frequently since James appeared in her life, not because we were suddenly close, but because Vivian, when she is excited about something, wants an audience, and I have historically been the most available one. She described James in the specific, careful way of someone who wants you to understand the significance without sounding like you're listing credentials. He was from a family she described as established. He had gone to school in Boston, had a career in finance, had an apartment in Back Bay that she had visited twice, and mentioned with a particular reverence that told me everything I needed to know about what she was imagining. "Mom is completely overwhelmed," Vivian said, laughing. "She's already talking about the house and how she wants it to look. You know how she gets." I did know how she got. My mother has 2 modes, the version of herself she presents to the world and the version that exists when there's no one important watching. The gap between them is significant and has widened over the years as Vivian's romantic life became a potential avenue to the kind of stability and social position my mother had always wanted for the family. When Vivian brought home a boyfriend from a certain kind of background, the first mode engaged completely. My mother called me 3 days before the dinner. She wanted me to come early and help prepare. She described what she needed: cooking, setup, cleanup before James arrived. She wanted the house to look a specific way. She wanted the food to be a specific standard. She wanted, she said, everything to be perfect. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I said yes because I always said yes, because I am the daughter who handles things. And in my family, handling things means showing up early and doing the invisible work that makes the visible moment possible. I arrived at 3 in the afternoon. James was expected at 6. I cooked for 3 hours. I made my mother's roast, the one she has taken credit for at every family gathering for 20 years, the one where the recipe is actually my grandmother's and the labor is actually mine. I prepared 2 sides. I made a dessert from scratch because my mother mentioned in passing that she had once told James she was a real cook. By 5:30, the table was set, the food was ready, the house looked exactly the way my mother wanted it to look. I was in the kitchen washing up when the front door opened. My mother's voice changed immediately. I could hear it from the kitchen, the shift from her regular register into the performance register, warm and rounded and slightly elevated, the voice she uses when someone important is in the room. I heard Vivian's laugh. I heard a lower voice, James. I dried my hands. I walked to the kitchen doorway. My mother saw me. And I watched the thing happen in real time, the flicker of calculation, the glance at my apron, at the dish towel in my hand, at the very specific picture I made standing in the kitchen doorway after 3 hours of invisible labor. And she made a choice. And this is Elena. She helps us with the house. James looked at me. I looked at him. I looked at my mother. She held my gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough to make sure I understood that it was deliberate, long enough to communicate that she had considered the alternative, introducing me as her daughter, her younger daughter, the one who just spent 3 hours making the meal he was about to eat, and had decided against it. Because I was wearing an apron, because I had flour on my hands, because James was from Back Bay, and my mother had been constructing a family narrative for 8 months that did not have room in it for a daughter who cooked while the other daughter was courted. "Nice to meet you," James said. "You too," I said. And I went back to the sink. I want to pause here and ask you something honestly. Have you ever been erased in real time by someone who was supposed to claim you? Not forgotten, deliberately excluded, a choice made in a second to make you smaller than you are because your existence complicates the story they're telling. Drop it in the comments, because I know the answer for a lot of you is yes, and I know how specific that kind of silence feels. I stayed for dinner. I'm aware that sounds strange. I stayed for the dinner after being introduced as the help, but I want to explain the specific calculus of it. I stayed because leaving would have required a scene, and I have spent 27 years avoiding scenes in my family the way other people avoid traffic. Not because I don't notice the obstruction, but because I have learned that engaging with it costs more than going around. I removed my apron, I sat at the far end of the table, I ate the food I had cooked, I participated in the conversation when I was spoken to, and stayed quiet when I wasn't. James was seated across from Vivian, kitty corner to me. He was exactly what Vivian's description had suggested. Composed, thoughtful, the kind of person who asks follow-up questions rather than waiting for the conversation to come back around to him. He asked me, about halfway through the meal, what I did for work. My mother's eyes moved to me. "Project management," I said. "Construction industry." "Oh, that's interesting. What kind of projects?" I described my work briefly. Commercial builds, timeline management, contractor coordination. He asked 2 more questions. I answered them. My mother changed the subject. James let the subject change happen. He didn't push. But I noticed, and I have thought about this many times since, that he was quiet for a few minutes after that. The particular quiet of someone who is listening to something underneath the conversation, rather than the conversation itself. I left right after dinner. I did not help clean up. That was the first time, in 27 years of being asked to help, that I left without finishing the task. It was small. Nobody said anything about it. My mother gave me a look that I recognized and did not respond to, and I got my coat and my bag and I said goodbye to the table and I walked out the front door. I sat in my car in the driveway for about 2 minutes, and then something strange happened. There was a knock on my passenger window. I looked up. It was James. He was standing in the driveway in his coat, and when I lowered the window, he said, quietly, in a voice that I understood immediately was calibrated for not being heard from inside the house, "I wanted to say goodnight, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry about earlier, the introduction. That wasn't right." I looked at him. "You caught that?" I said. "Yes, I caught that," he said. A pause. "Your sister talks about you sometimes. She mentions you in passing, but the version of you she describes and the version of you I just had dinner with don't quite match." I didn't say anything. "He's not asking you to explain your family to me. I just wanted you to know that I'm paying attention." He said goodnight. He went back inside. I sat in that driveway for another 10 minutes, and then I drove home. And I thought, I don't know what that man is going to do with what he just said, but something is going to happen, and I need to decide, before it does, what I'm willing to be honest about and what I'm not. I did not contact James after that night. I want to be clear about this. I did not engineer what happened next. I did not reach out to him, did not send him information, did not conduct any kind of campaign to tell my side of the story. What happened in the weeks that followed happened because James is the kind of person who notices things and then quietly investigates them, and because my family had not been careful enough to make sure their narrative was airtight. It wasn't. Here's what I know happened. reconstructed partly from James himself and partly from Vivienne, who told me things in a later conversation that she probably hadn't intended to reveal. James, after the dinner, began paying closer attention to the discrepancies in the story he'd been told about my family. He is, by training and by profession, someone who evaluates risk. He looks at numbers and finds the inconsistencies. He asks the question that makes the numbers make sense. The first inconsistency, my mother's description of the family's lifestyle versus the visible reality of the house and their finances, which, and this is something I had been aware of for years, did not fully align with the image she was projecting. My parents are not wealthy. They are comfortable in the specific way of people who have made reasonable choices over a long career and have a paid-off house and a modest retirement account. They are not the kind of established family my mother's performance suggested. The gap between the performance and the reality is something I had grown up navigating, but James was seeing it for the first time, and he was seeing it with fresh eyes. The second inconsistency, Vivienne's account of her own career and financial independence, which, as James began to look more closely, contained some optimistic descriptions of ventures that a quick search revealed had not lasted or had not existed in the form she described. James told me later that he had not been trying to catch anyone in anything. He was simply, as he put it, doing what I do. I look at the whole picture before I make a decision. The third inconsistency, and this is the one that I think mattered most, was me. Vivienne had mentioned me, James said, about 6 times over the course of 8 months. Each mention was brief and positioned me as peripheral, a younger sister who was fine, doing okay, living nearby, not particularly central to the family story. The version of me Vivienne had presented to James was essentially a footnote. But the person James had dinner with was not a footnote. He told me this directly, months later. The way you handled that introduction, the way you stayed, the way you answered my questions and then didn't push when the conversation moved on, that's not someone who's peripheral. That's someone who's been trained to make themselves small. Trained to make themselves small, I repeated. Yes, he said, and the training was very clearly intentional. James began asking Vivienne questions, not confrontational ones. James does not do confrontation directly, I've learned. He does something more patient and more effective, which is to ask gentle questions and then wait to see which answers don't hold up. He asked about my job. He asked where I had gone to school. He asked what my relationship with the family was like. He asked, at one point, whether the meal at the family dinner had been catered or homemade. Vivienne said it was her mother's cooking. James nodded. He did not say anything else, but he filed it. 3 weeks after the dinner, James told Vivienne that he wanted to see her family again. More casually this time, not a formal dinner, just a Sunday afternoon. He wanted to get to know everyone better. My mother, informed of this, called me. She wanted me to come on Sunday afternoon. She did not ask me to cook. She asked me to come as, and these are her exact words, just yourself, honey. Casual. I understood the shift immediately. Something had changed. The calibration had changed. I said I'd be there. I want to pause here and ask you something. When someone finally starts to see you, really see you, after years of being made invisible, what does it feel like? Is it relief? Is it something more complicated than that? Tell me in the comments, because for me, standing in my kitchen on a Thursday evening, processing my mother's phone call, it was one of the most complicated feelings I've had. Right here. James is asking questions. My mother's phone call has changed tone in a way I haven't heard before. Something is shifting. In my family, in the story they've been telling, in the space I'm allowed to occupy within it. Something is moving, slowly and surely, toward a moment that is going to require everyone in that house to be honest in a way they haven't been. And I'm about to tell you what happened on that Sunday. What James said, what my mother said when she finally couldn't manage the narrative anymore, and what I chose to do with the power that arrived. Quietly, without anyone planning for it, when the truth finally had a witness who wasn't going to let it be managed away. Before I tell you, if this story is reaching something real, if you have been the person standing in the foyer holding a dish towel, being introduced as something less than you are by people who should have known better, hit subscribe right now. I make a new story every single week about families, about the performance of love that isn't quite love, about what happens when someone finally pays attention. Subscribe, and then stay. Because the Sunday afternoon is the part of this story I have been building toward since the moment James knocked on my car window in the driveway. I arrived at my parents' house on Sunday at 2 in the afternoon. James was already there. Vivian was there. My parents were in the living room doing the comfortable, casual version of family that my mother performs when the stakes feel slightly lower or when she has been given reason to believe she needs to expand the frame. I arrived in my own clothes. No apron, no dish towel. My own clothes, my own face, the straightforward version of myself that I present at work every day. My mother introduced me. Elena, my younger daughter. My younger daughter. Not the maid, not she helps with the house. My younger daughter. I looked at her. She held my gaze for exactly as long as it took to confirm that she knew I had registered the difference. James stood and shook my hand. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as recognition. Not the polite recognition of we've met before. The other kind. The kind that acknowledges a shared understanding of something that had happened and hadn't been named. "Good to see you again, Elena," he said. "You too," I said. We sat. We had coffee. The conversation was the relaxed, ranging kind that Sunday afternoons are supposed to produce. Work, travel, the specific small observations that accumulate into the texture of actually knowing someone. James asked me questions. He was deliberate about it in a way that was visible without being aggressive. He would ask Vivian something, then my parents, then me, including me in the rotation with a consistency that I had never experienced in a family gathering in my entire adult life. My parents adapted. Watching them adapt was one of the stranger experiences of my recent years. My mother, specifically, watching her recalibrate her performance in real time, expanding it to include me, adding detail and warmth to her descriptions of my work and my life in ways she had never volunteered before, was like watching someone adjust the aperture on a camera and seeing the full frame for the first time. But then something happened that nobody had planned for. My father, who is a less careful performer than my mother, and who sometimes says the true thing in social situations because he has not rehearsed the conversation carefully enough, made a comment about the house. He was telling a story about a repair that needed doing, and he said, casually, without thinking about it, "I was going to ask Elena to look into it. She handles a lot of the house maintenance coordination for us." He caught himself, but not quickly enough. My father looked at my mother, then at me, and he said very gently, "How long has Elena been handling things for the family?" The question was simple, conversational almost, but it had a weight to it that the room felt immediately. My father looked at my mother looked at me, and for a moment, one long specific moment, everyone in the room understood that the answer to James's question was the answer to a much larger question, the one about the $63,000, the ones about the dinners I cooked and the repair coordination and the business plans I reviewed and the maid introduction in the foyer 3 weeks ago. "A long time," I said, quietly, steadily, looking at James. "A long time," I said again. James nodded slowly. He looked at my parents, he looked at Vivian, and then he said something that I have turned over in my mind so many times since. "That seems like a lot to carry." Not an accusation, not a confrontation, just an observation, offered simply, put in the center of the table for everyone to sit with. The room was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then my mother said, "Elena has always been very capable." And I said, for the first time in 29 years, to my mother, in front of an audience, "Yes, I have." The way I said it was different from anything I had said in that house before. I didn't say it as a deflection or a modesty or a quiet acceptance of a left-handed compliment. I said it as a fact, a plain, stated, undeniable fact. And the room heard the difference. Nothing dramatic happened in the weeks that followed. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a single confrontation, a speech, a moment where everything collapses and then rebuilds. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and more complete than that. James and Vivian continued seeing each other. I know they had several conversations during that period that I was not part of, conversations in which James asked Vivian questions about our family that Vivian apparently struggled to answer in the way she had previously been answering them. Vivian called me about 3 weeks after the Sunday afternoon. The call was different from our usual calls, less performing, less one-directional. She asked me how I was, not as an opener to something else, as an actual question. We talked for an hour. I told her, for the first time with any real directness, how I had felt at the family dinner. Not the Sunday one, the first one. The introduction, the foyer, the dish towel. She was quiet for a long time after I said it. "I didn't know that happened," she said. "You were right there." "I know, but I wasn't paying attention the way I should have been. I was thinking about how the evening was going, and I missed it." I believed her, partially. I think Vivian exists in a state of sufficiently self-focused attention that the experience of the people immediately around her is genuinely available to her only when something forces her to look. James had forced her to look. "He asked me things," she said, "about you, about the family, about money and how things have worked. And some of the things he asked, I didn't have good answers for them. Not because I was lying, because I had never thought about them." "What kinds of things?" She was quiet for a moment. "He asked where the money came for the boutique and the consulting arrangement and the car. And he didn't say anything critical. He just nodded. And then he asked, 'How did you pay for college?' What did you tell him?" "I said you had loans and worked." And he asked if I had loans, and I said no. And he asked why not, and I said Mom and Dad helped. And he said, She stopped. "What did he say?" He said, "Does Elena know the exact numbers?" And I said, "I didn't know if you did." And he said, "She probably does. She strikes me as someone who keeps track." She strikes me as someone who keeps track. I had to sit with that for a moment, because he was right. And because no one had ever named it before, not as a strength, not with that particular quality of recognition, the capability that my family had always used as a justification for not helping me, had been seen by this person who barely knew me as something worth naming. About a month after that call, I did something I had never done before. I wrote my parents a letter, not about the maid introduction specifically, not about any single incident, about the pattern, the 63,000 and the 0, the plans I reviewed and the cooking I did and the maintenance I coordinated and the labor, years of it, that had flowed for me toward the family without any of us ever really naming what it was. I was not angry in the letter. I have learned over 29 years that anger in my family gets managed rather than heard. I was precise. I told them what I had observed. I told them what it had cost me, specifically, in time and energy, and the particular tax that invisible labor levies on the person performing it. I told them that I intended, going forward, to be my own resource first, and if they wanted a relationship with me that was real rather than functional, I was open to building one. I sent it on a Tuesday. I did not call to follow up. I waited for them to come to me. My mother called on Thursday. She cried, the real kind. She said, "I didn't think about it as a pattern. I thought about each thing separately. I never added it up." I know, I did. James proposed to Vivian 4 months after the family dinner. I know this because Vivian called me first. Before she called my parents, before she called anyone, she called me. "He asked," she said, "and before I said yes, I needed to call you. I didn't understand immediately. Why? Because he told me, before he asked, that the relationship he was stepping into wasn't just with me. That if he was going to be part of this family, he wanted to make sure the family was honest. And he said, specifically Elena, he said that he wasn't going to be part of something where one person was invisible. I held the phone very still. He said he had watched what happened at the dinner and the Sunday, and he had listened to what I told him about money and about college and about how things have worked. And he said that if he was going to be here, really here, he wanted things to be different, more honest. What did you say? I said yes, Vivian said. And I also said he was right. We were both quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she said, for the things I didn't pay attention to for a long time. It was, in the context of everything, a small apology. Imperfect, not complete, not a full accounting of everything that had accumulated over 29 years. But it was real, and it was the first one. My mother's behavior shifted in the months after my letter. Not completely, and not instantly. Patterns that form over decades don't dissolve in a season. But the shift was real and visible in ways I hadn't experienced before. She began introducing me correctly, every time, without the qualification, without the adjustment for who was in the room and what image she was trying to project. She called me on my birthday, not late in the evening, in the morning. She asked me once if she could visit my apartment. She came over on a Saturday, brought flowers, sat at my kitchen table, and spent 2 hours in what I can only describe as the most honest conversation we have ever had. About her own childhood, about what she had wanted for Vivian and why, about what she had assumed about me versus what had been true. I thought you didn't need it, she said, the same sentence my parents always used, the sentence I had heard my entire life. I thought because you were fine, you were okay. Being fine and being okay aren't the same thing, I said. She didn't answer immediately. No, she said finally. I'm learning that. James and Vivian's engagement has been ongoing for 6 months. The wedding is being planned. I have been included, genuinely, not functionally, in conversations about the plans, not as the person who coordinates things and then disappears, as the sister. James, in the specific way of people who do things through structure rather than drama, has quietly made himself available to me in the family in a way that shifts the distribution of attention without making a production of it. He asks me questions directly. He includes me in conversations. He does not perform or announce what he is doing. He just does it. Has anyone ever been that person for you? Not someone who made a speech or confronted the problem head-on, but someone who simply, persistently, quietly, week by week, shifted the room until you had space in it. Tell me in the comments. It has been 14 months since the family dinner. In 14 months, here is what I know. I know that what happened in that foyer, the introduction, the dish towel, my mother's 1-second gaze before she made her choice, was not the worst thing that had happened in my family. It was the most visible, the most stark, the version of the pattern that had a witness, but the pattern itself had been running quietly for 29 years before James knocked on my car window. I have been in therapy for 8 months. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Chandra, who works in family systems, introduced me to a phrase I've been sitting with since our 3rd session: covert hierarchies. The way some families establish a clear priority structure: who matters most, whose needs come first, whose potential is worth the family's resources, without ever saying it explicitly. The hierarchy operates through 1,000 small choices, none of which is ever named as part of the system. Each one is just a decision, a practical thing. Vivian needed the money. You were fine. It was just that one time, except it was never just that one time. And the covert hierarchy, once you can see it, is not subtle at all. The work I've been doing in therapy is not primarily about my family. It's about my own reflexes, the ones I developed inside that hierarchy to survive it. The reflex of making myself useful before someone notices I'm there. The reflex of managing things quietly so nobody has to see the management happening. The reflex of absorbing, without naming, for years, what the absorption is costing me. Dr. Chandra calls it the invisible worker's adaptation. You become so proficient at the invisible work that the people around you stop being able to see it. And eventually, you stop being able to see it yourself. You just see the output and call it being capable. I am capable, but I am not just capable. I am a person, a full one, with needs that are as real as the needs that received $63,000 of support over 5 years, with potential that was always worth investing in, even when nobody was investing in it. I know that now. I did not know it as clearly before. I want to say something directly to you before we close. If you have been standing in a foyer, figuratively or literally, holding the evidence of your own invisible labor, being introduced as something less than what you are by people who know exactly what you are, I want you to hear this. The people who make you invisible are not doing it because you are invisible. They are doing it because you are so competent, so present, so quietly essential that they have learned they can afford to look away from you, that you will handle it, that you will stay, that you will cook the meal and wash the pan and stand in the doorway and absorb the introduction with a steady face and go back to the sink. That competence is real, but it is not an excuse for what is done with it. You are not the maid. You have never been the maid. And any person who looks at you for more than 30 seconds in a room where you are being managed as something smaller than you are, any person who is paying real attention will see it. Maybe you're living a version of this. Maybe the foyer is different. Maybe the dish towel is a different object. Maybe the introduction is dressed up in different words, like she handles things or she's always so capable. Or the quiet, consistent absence of acknowledgement that communicates over years the same thing my mother said in one sentence. Maybe nobody has knocked on your car window yet. Maybe the person who is paying attention hasn't shown up yet. I want you to know that person exists. In some form, in some situation, at some point, there is always someone who is watching more carefully than the room knows. Someone for whom the gap between who you are and how you're being presented is visible. And what you do while you wait for that person to knock on the window matters. Keep being excellent. Keep being precise. Keep knowing your own worth, even in rooms that don't reflect it back. Because the work you do, the real work, the visible and invisible both, is the thing that speaks when the narrative someone else has built around you can no longer hold. One final question. When James knocked on my car window that evening, when he said, "I wanted to say goodnight, and I'm sorry about earlier, that wasn't right," what would you have done? Would you have let it go? Said it was fine? Said it was nothing? Absorbed it the way you absorb everything? Or would you have told the truth? Drop it in the comments. I think the answer says something important about where we each are in the journey from invisible to seen. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because I'll be here next week with another one. There's a story in the description I think you'll need just as much as this one. I'll see you in the next one.